So thanks everybody for joining this showcase session hosted by ESOA. I'm joined today by my colleagues from our member companies, Michael Rapelier from Viasat, who's Vice President of Government Affairs, and Peter Hall, who you'll see shortly, who's Head of Sales for Intelsat, and also Richard Womersley, who's Head of Director of Spectrum Services at LS Telcom. We're going to start this session by showing you a pre-recorded video with a small presentation. It's not very long, and I would invite you to already share your questions on the session chat, and we will host a discussion after that. Thanks a lot.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Forum Europe to allow ESOA hold this showcase session. My name is Natalia Vicente, and I'm the Head of Public Affairs at ESOA. As this session is today virtual and many people from around the globe has joined, and for the benefit for those that are not very familiar with ESOA, let me tell you a little bit about us. ESOA is the satellite association representing 20 satellite operators providing global satellite telecommunication services. In today's showcase, we will tackle a key question. Is spectrum the answer to Europe connectivity questions? Next slide, please. Prior to the pandemic, many of us were conscious about the existence of a digital divide. However, in many cases, we could think about it for the developing countries and something that had nothing to do with Europe. However, this pandemic has highlighted the need for connectivity, but also the existence of a digital divide even in Europe, where 3% is still unconnected, and this represents 6 million European households. While in many countries, like in the UK, a 10 megabit per second connection, it is an acceptable internet connection, the European rural targets is 30 megabit per second, what could prevent, and in some cases risks preventing, connectivity at all in those places. So we know that deploying fiber to the premises, it has a very high cost. And this problem persists when we talk about fixed wireless access. So it is clear that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So with these facts, is spectrum still the answer? Next slide, please. So as I was saying, deploying fiber to the premises has a very high cost. So the cost per household is prohibitive. And with fixed wireless access, it gets better, but not when we talk about millimeter wave, because we still need to deploy multiple small cells, and this becomes expensive. So is C-band the answer? Well, this still needs to extend base stations and fiber backhaul to complete the solutions. So it becomes expensive. However, with satellite, it is a pan-European solution that is available today, and it provides between 20 and 50 megabit per second at competitive rates. So I will now pass the floor to my colleague Arti, that she will go through different examples from our members.
Thank you, Natalia. Next slide. So we thought that it would be appropriate, as we are still emerging from the lockdown across Europe, to actually give you an impression of what our industry has been doing during COVID. The first thing is in terms of satellite broadband direct to the home, so consumer broadband, our members have seen 70% increase in traffic over their connections and many more new subscriptions happening across Western and Central Europe. The highest take-ups have been in Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the UK. In addition, MNOs have requested more satellite capacity to support 24/7 connectivity, not just at peak times. One example is from Japan, where one of our members saw a 100% increase in traffic. Now, of course, Japan is not European, but it is still a developed country with a significant rural population. So we thought it could be representative and a valuable example to show. Next slide. We also wanted to share with you the results of a study done by Sandvin, which looked at all of the different technologies and how they were being used during COVID. We were struck by how the usage over satellite was absolutely comparable and very typical compared with any other broadband platform. It was used for numerous social applications, and from our members, we know that while typically the usage that they observe is usually at peak hours. During this time, with so many people being in their holiday homes or working from areas where they felt safer, the usage was actually 24/7. It was from home workers and students, typically for business, education, and social use. And as I said, enabling the same experience as any other broadband platform would enable. Next slide. But it's not just about the personal use. It's also absolutely about maintaining safety and essential services during COVID as well. So the image on your left is actually of a command vehicle stationed outside the NHS Nighting Hospital in the middle of London. So you can see that the use of satellite is even in the most fibered areas. And the reason for this, I spoke with the Accelerate CEO, and he told me that these these users actually need secure connectivity, a secure network, a guaranteed service, and they don't want to take the risk of delays or other outages due to 4G or LTE congestion. The other image is one from the Royal Bank of Scotland and NatWest, which at any one time, they have 19 mobile banking vehicles, which are covering 7,000 miles around the UK. You can see that in our presentation, we've assumed a pre-Brexit European scenario. But so that's just a highlight of what satellite was doing during the lockdown. And now I want to hand over to Richard, who's going to talk to you about the actual question on whether spectrum is the answer.
Thank you, Arti, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And so we're going to have a look at the question of, is spectrum the answer? If we could have the first slide, please, and we'll move to the second one. So at the end of the day, any kind of telecommunications service is a balance between three things. It's a balance between coverage, capacity, and cost. And as the balance shows, you can't change one without having to affect the others. So the question then I think we should be looking at is, how does spectrum affect this balance? If you add spectrum as a kind of fourth tier, how does it change the balance between cost, coverage, and capacity? Next slide, please. So let's first of all ask the question, does spectrum improve coverage? And there's a nice diagram here taken from Ericsson, which shows clearly the difference that you get in different frequency bands. So the millimeter wave bands, tons of bandwidth, very low latency, very, very small coverage areas. And the lower frequency bands, sub 1 gigahertz, much wider coverage, very little bandwidth available, and lower and larger latency. So can spectrum improve coverage? Well, if we can find lots of spectrum below 1 gigahertz, then that, of course, will provide better coverage than the millimeter wave would. But there is a limited amount of that, and it's not going to be something that we can just dig out of the ground and make more of. The thing is, even if we had that spectrum, we'd still have to roll it out on cell sites. And that spectrum requires new infrastructure, and that infrastructure is additional cost. So it doesn't follow that if you've got additional spectrum, even in the low frequency bands, that it would immediately lead to an increase in coverage. You still need to roll out the infrastructure. What about, and as we've seen a lot in the recent pandemic period, what if we give people more spectrum in bands they can use? So give them more spectrum where they've already got facilities. And in that does improve coverage a little bit, because it takes the load off the cell if you can reduce the load by improving the amount of bandwidth you have available. But fundamentally, spectrum doesn't make a big dent on improving coverage. Next slide, please. Does spectrum improve capacity? Well, it does if you use it. And I'm sure many of you may have seen this diagram before, but it's still true today. The amount of spectrum that's been licensed in various countries is well below that which could have been licensed. It's well below what the forecast said. And we know that not all of that spectrum is in use. And it comes down to the same issue. If you give people more spectrum in a new spectrum band, they still have to build the infrastructure to use it. It's not an immediate thing. If you give MNO spectrum in existing bands, then that does allow them to increase their capacity without necessarily additional cost if their equipment allows them, for example, to change from a 10 megahertz carrier to a 20 megahertz carrier. But spectrum only improves capacity if you can use it. Next slide, please. So is spectrum the answer? Depends what the question is. However, without spectrum, there is definitely no wireless broadband of any kind whatsoever. So it's certainly an answer to that. Does more spectrum improve coverage and capacity? Well, it can be done, but it still requires new infrastructure. And with that new infrastructure comes additional costs. And that's the balance, cost capacity balance. We can't add anything without changing the. New bands require investment in new infrastructure, and so that's new additional cost. Spectrum can reduce the cost of increasing capacity by, for example, allowing us to use more spectrum, wider bandwidths, and that does help, but it still requires changes in infrastructure, which is still costly. So is spectrum the answer? Well, it's part of the answer. It's not the only answer. Infrastructure is still critical. And we have to remember that spectrum isn't just for mobile operators. It's for all the wireless technology solutions, including Wi-Fi, including satellite. All of these still comply with the same balance, that you still can't change capacity and coverage without changing the cost. It's just that the balance might be different between different technologies. Satellite has very wide area coverage, but tends to have somewhat less capacity. Whereas millimeter wave, for example, will provide very, very high capacity, but over a very small area. So there's still a balance to be had. At this point, I would like to hand back to the ladies from ESOA.
Thank you. So that was our pre-recorded presentation. And now we're going to start a discussion. So if anybody has questions, feel free to type them into the chat. I'm going to kick off the session myself by asking Michael, first of all, when is satellite broadband the right solution? We have the impression that it's the answer for the last 3% or so, but when is it really the go-to? What is the target market for satellite broadband?
So thanks. It's become abundantly clear that the case that we had in the past is that satellite broadband wasn't very good. And Viasat came along, among others, and developed high-capacity, end-to-end satellite broadband solutions, delivering 100 megabits per second speeds to the house in a residential broadband application. In these cases, the ideal customer for us, and I'm going to talk about breakfast, at least in America, a donut. So a city center is surrounded by typically, just picture a donut with the city center in the middle. The perfect customer for us is a kind of an exurb customer. But also that has an expectation of high capacity speeds, great broadband, and may work in a city center. In addition, the sprinkles. Those are the sprinkles that may be in the city center. I have a colleague who lives in Berlin, and she has DSL to her home. This is the case in many areas. This is a sprinkle. For some reason, fiber or cable was not run to that premise. So in that case, that's an ideal customer for us. So I think the preconceived notion is that satellite is only for the remote farmer. Not so much the case anymore.
Excellent, thanks. And can you tell us, I know that Viasat also provides service in European countries as well. What is the type of speeds that you can achieve with satellite broadband today?
So let me answer what we achieve today, and then I'll talk about Europe, our path for Europe. Okay. What we are achieving and delivering today is, as I mentioned, 100 megabits per second. We're doing that to hundreds of thousands of households today. Mm-hmm. And that's installed in a half a day to a day, very quick. In Europe, we have a plan where we're going to launch our third generation satellite. Our first generation satellite had about 140 gigabits per second, and that competed against DSL very effectively. Our second generation satellite, which is up and running now, is delivering 50 to 100 megabits per second speeds, and that's double the capacity of the first one. Our third generation satellite, and I note our colleagues' comments about spectrum and the trade-offs between coverage and capacity. We've kind of achieved that. We'll say spectrum is key to us, and it fuels all of those things that you talked about, Richard. So just as a point of clarification. So our third generation satellite, which will cover Europe, Middle East, and Africa, will be in service around 2022. And with that, we'll be able to deliver 100 megabits per second speeds and faster.
Brilliant, thanks. So, Richard, COVID has changed user behavior. Even companies are saying that they're going to start making telework part of the norm. To what extent will this impact the balance of demand for spectrum from different technologies, in your view?
It's interesting, isn't it? You know, I was in central London just before lockdown, using my phone for 4G and getting 300 megabits per second because no one was using it. And I suspect for the last 3 months, no one else has used it either. It's been sat there with no users whatsoever. Whereas people are working from home, and as Michael said, the donut extends beyond just the edge of the cities into the rural areas, where maybe there's very little or no coverage at all. So it's almost upside down. You know, mobile networks and usage has always been planned for dense urban, heavy commercial use, and in fact it's the other way now. Those commercial areas are not being used and the traffic is elsewhere, and I think that has to change the way that we think about how we put the solutions that can deliver the activity that people now need. It's no longer just in the cities, it's everywhere, and many of those places don't have coverage. I don't know if you saw in the session earlier, we asked people what they thought the focus should be going forward and what we've learned from COVID. Coverage, capacity, and reliability were the three things people asked for. And I can only imagine they answered the questions that way because they've suffered at some point recently from a lack of coverage, a lack of capacity, or a lack of reliability. And so I think we just need to rethink a little bit about where we focus spectrum, how we focus it, and how we use it to make sure that everybody, whether they're in a city or in fact increasingly not in a city, can actually get access to the services they need.
Brilliant, thank you. We have a question on the chat about where will 12 gigahertz for spectrum come from in the new European Union radio spectrum, and will it or should it be all for terrestrial 4G, 5G? Richard, do you want to give your view on that before I bring in Peter?
Sure. I note the question. Where should it come from? Well, the requirement is for it to be under 100 gigahertz. You know, there's an enormous amount of spectrum above 60, 70 gigahertz that's not heavily used. So maybe it could come from there and we could find it tomorrow and move on to something more interesting. I think the bigger question is whether it should just be for 4G and 5G, or should it be for other things as well? And it would be good, wouldn't it, to be able to look back at what's gone on, look at this issue now of providing coverage everywhere and say, well, we need more than just a terrestrial solution. We need more than just mobile. We need fixed access as well. So maybe we should be identifying spectrum for those kind of things. There's an agenda item at the next WRC, for example, to look at identifying fixed wireless spectrum, which for commercial wireless deployment, which has never been done before. So maybe there should be IMT mobile, IMT fixed, and IMT satellite, and then we get the best of all worlds.
Opportunity to bring in Peter from Intelsat. Peter, I'm glad you could make it with us. Peter, tell us, how is the drive to roll out 5G impacting the satellite ecosystem? And let's tie that in with Alexander Kuhn's question, which you can see on the chat, that the offering for consumers now is mobile service and a home service. Satellite has potential of ubiquitous coverage. So where's the issue? Is it the antenna? Where's the issue standing in the way of connecting people in the home, in your view?
I think the issue as to why satellite has not been seen as the obvious go-to solution for unconnected areas of Europe in recent years has been a mix of a lack of knowledge within the telco base that plans networks. It plans very much on fixed pipes, fiber and microwave, because satellite technology placed itself obsolete some years ago with wideband inefficient solution, wide beam inefficient solutions, which had a very high cost point. Thankfully, that's changed. The technology in the satellite sector has moved on drastically over the last few years. We can deliver very efficient solutions now, which are far more relevant to the telco's needs than they ever were before. So I think that's something that's changed significantly. There is also growing political pressure in many countries, certainly in Western Europe, to improve geographic coverage. So regulators had only ever previously applied pressure to MNOs and telcos to provide a percentage coverage of the population. The political pressure is now growing to provide better geographic coverage for the first time in many parts of Western Europe, as we see this elsewhere in the world as well. And that's coinciding at a time that networks are thinking about how they move to 5G. Where do they get the spectrum from to do that? Well, they get them from the government. The government also wants something now in return to answer the political pressure that it's under, and that is addressing the geographic coverage that its voters are after. And that's something we see going hand in hand now. As 5G spectrum discussions are advanced with licensing and paying for that spectrum, so the regulator is also beginning to push that political pressure through onto the MNOs to start focusing on geographic coverage for the first time in Western Europe.
Thank you. And Richard, you mentioned how people are actually using less their mobile phones and more Wi-Fi these days. And that's also something which satellite does, create backhauling to create Wi-Fi hotspots and community Wi-Fi. Michael, can you tell us something about the work that Viasat's been doing in that field?
Sure, and just a quick comment. I think people are recognizing during this COVID pandemic the incredible use of these computers, right? These laptops versus these guys, right? So we've seen on our fixed service offering, and I'll get to the community Wi-Fi in a minute, that has increased up to 70% in our business. And as people learn from home, do telehealth, and actually do what we're doing today. From a community Wi-Fi perspective, we have been able to employ the same kit that we do for our home broadband business into hard to reach places around the world that have no coverage. So we've gone to villages so far in Latin America and are now installed in 5,000 locations, and we've done that in under 18 months. So we've connected as many as 1.5 million people to the internet. They bring their own device, they receive a PIN from their local store, and they hop online. They can buy packages as low as 50 cents per hour, but there's also packages of half day and day. So very flexible, very affordable, and it's part of the diverse product offering that makes broadband, satellite broadband, affordable and very efficient for all to use.
We have another question on whether anybody, the panelists, can give a rough prediction of the aggregate supply by, say, 2025 across the EU in terms of satellite, be it geo or non-geo, supporting European households, say, receiving 100 megabit per second peak download speed. Does anybody have a view on that? Want to take that question?
Yeah, I don't think there are any statistics that are readily available. I'm sure NSR would have come up with something for us if if they'd done the research. But I think it's very difficult to predict a percentage that the satellite will take into broadband into the home. I think it's also worth making a distinction between talking about MNOs, 4G, 5G, LTE, and broadband connected into the home. I don't think necessarily satellite's got a massive role to play in undermining sort of ADSL connections that are going to homes on copper today. That's a, a very different price point from cellular backhaul from 4G, which is like has a very strong role.
Yeah, and look, we have two of the ESOA members on the call. You both have very different business propositions. So, Michael, tell us about Viasat's view on that.
Let me explain. So, our business isn't a backhaul business. It's a providing service to customers' business wherever they are, whether they're in planes or at their homes. And so, our business model is diverse. It is at the top. If we had a pyramid, we'd have a government business, smaller customers, but let's just say they may pay a bit more for critical broadband use. And at the bottom, very broad, and that's the residential broadband business. In all cases, and let's just say in the middle, we have community Wi-Fi. We need this stack of businesses, right, to make all of the businesses work and to buy down some of the affordability. For Europe, I take your point, Peter, very well in that the environment has changed. One, let's just say that satellite broadband has improved, right? So the quality of service is much higher. Two, the concept of expanding broadband outside of a city in order to cover all of the geographic territory. A budget of X billions of euros cannot do that with fiber. You can't do that with fiber. So a blend of solutions, and we're seeing this all over the world, is the case. As far as our plan for Europe, as I mentioned, we will be launching a satellite that will cover Europe, Middle East, and Africa. The infrastructure investment is tremendous. That will be in the European continent. And the service will vary based upon markets, but the quality of service will be as high as 100 megabits per second.
Great. So, what you've both said has shown the variety of different satellite services that are on offer. Now, what do governments need to do? Peter, you talked about universal service obligations increasing, and I think COVID has really shone a spotlight on the need for that. Yeah. But also there's voucher schemes that is implemented for satellite broadband in some countries. What more can governments do, in your view, to help bridge the digital divide in Europe?
In my view, I think it's beginning to happen. You see this actively in UK, Germany, France. The regulators there are taking a far more active role than they ever have done in the past. And you're right. I think that the current situation with COVID is shining a light on that. People are no longer commuting into London, for example, in the UK to go to work, and it's the same in big cities all around the world. And they're staying at home. Many of them outside of the cities. Like we are all today, working from our home offices, using the broadband infrastructure that's available to us. And I think there's been a lot of commentary in the press that this could well be the new norm after the problem. And that can only serve to increase the political pressure that's applied to governments, which then comes back through the regulator onto MNOs, telcos, broadband providers. So I think it's inevitable that this unfortunate situation is going to accelerate what the regulators and governments do to put pressure on the MNOs and telcos to provide coverage. The reality is, if you're the CEO of a big MNO or telco, you're going to focus on where the most of the population is, and that's in a city. That's how you drive the needle for your business. That's how you make it move. So it is going to need some political intervention to force them to divert resources, time and effort, not just money, but people power, to go and look at the rural areas, perhaps. And I think that is beginning to happen. It was happening before the coronavirus issue came about. But I'm fairly confident that that's going to accelerate the process after things have calmed down.
Artie, can I build upon Peter's comment? As far as what governments can do, I would say that adequate, consistent access to spectrum. is critical. It will drive investment. And the satellite broadband, what's enabled this development that has happened over the past 5, 6, 7 years to reach this point, including my own company, we've invested $3 billion of our own money into developing these satellite systems, and there's more after that, has been dependent upon the allocation tables of 27.5 to 30 gigahertz, the 28 gigahertz band being available. So when you're developing a satellite system, again, for our case, and there was a comment about the CapEx, the capital expenditure needed to align to spectrum, these are 5, 6 years in the making in investments. So if the spectrum is during that period refarmed for other purposes, that really slows private investment against these to reach these people in hard to reach places. So if there's one thing that I could point out that governments could do, not necessarily money, right, but consistent, adequate source of spectrum, that would be the number one thing from our perspective.
Thank you. Richard, let me come to you. Look, the mobile operators have been pretty relentless in their quest to acquire new spectrum. And at WRC19, we saw 17.5 gigahertz go to them. Do you believe there is still a case for more?
Is there a case for more? Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The RSPP is now looking for another 12 gigahertz. And I note in the comments there, a question from my colleague Saul about whether some of the spectrum could come from that was allocated to Inmarsat and Solaris. And I think it's actually a much wider question. It's a question of use it or lose it. And the reason that this is cropping up is because there's actually very little use of that spectrum. And the same could be true of mobile and satellite. So there are mobile bands which have been around for a long time that are not heavily used. It will be interesting to see exactly how long it takes, if ever, for that 17 gigahertz that's already been made available to actually be put into use. And if we do follow a use it or lose it, then maybe that will actually at some point go to someone else. The same might be true of some of the satellite spectrum, Q, V, W band, all of these high bands at the moment. There are filings and there are experiments and trials, but there's no real evidence of use of that either. So you can see there's a battle to come still for more spectrum. And I think the critical thing is, if you're, as I said in my introductory session, spectrum only actually is of any use if you use it. So I think that there is we need to focus on using the spectrum that we have, using it efficiently, using it effectively, putting it to good use, before we start looking for more and more and more spectrum for things that haven't used what they have already. I think, to me, that's where the question comes. The problem, of course, is with the ITU process being every 4 years, it's easy to say, well, we'll need it in the next period, so we can have it now, otherwise we'll miss the opportunity. I think that's got to change somehow.
Thank you. We have another question, which is, this is not spectrum related. In a recurrent COVID scenario and to assure high-speed, high-capacity, resilient broadband to rural and suburban areas, should we actually be lobbying the European Union to dedicate funding for satellite broadband solutions, or say to leave this to the so-called free market? Now, we are a sector which has traditionally actually relied on private investment. We are, unlike the telcos, we don't typically go lobbying for funding into our satellites per se. There is a case to, of course, support the end users, at least to overcome the initial barriers when it comes to consumer broadband, the cost of the installation of the dish and so on. But is there a case there? Should we be lobbying for more funding?
So Artie, I have a very specific take on this, and we do at Viasat. If we believe that the free market should enable customer choice. So if funding generally is not a good idea. However, competing against subsidized competition. If I'm going to enter a market and an incumbent telco or someone is receiving funding that I can't compete for whatever reason, that's a market that I'm not going to enter. And then who suffers? The customers suffer, right? They have a lack of competitor, another competitor in the market, so prices won't be pressured. The geographic coverage will be limited. So there will be more people left behind. So as we think about these funding policies, if we have to have them, let's make them technology neutral. Let's invite all to compete and truly compete for the funds so that the end customers, the citizens of the countries, benefit the most.
Brilliant. Peter, do you have a take on that?
In terms of forcing funding for this, you could say, do you force the funding on trying to apply for it out of governments, or do you go more of the universal service obligation route and force providers, the main incumbent telcos in each country to deliver a service? Then they have to go and look for what is the most cost-effective way of doing it. Mm-hmm. And it's analogous in that way, perhaps, the broadband sector, which we're discussing here, to the MNO sector, which I was talking about a few moments ago. The MNOs don't want to focus on the rural area, but if they're told they have to, then they have to go and find a solution that will do it. And I think it's perhaps the same in the broadband sector. So maybe a universal service obligation could achieve the same goal as applying for funding from a body, but I think just leaving it to market forces alone is unlikely to things to generate very fast.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of the questions. In conclusion, I think it's clear that spectrum alone is not the answer to everybody's problems. It certainly is very important for all sectors, and in particular for the satellite sector, we need certainty in order to continue to make all the private investment that we see going on. But we also have a variety of versatile and innovative solutions that we enable. And that's very important because one size doesn't fit all. So with that, I think I would like to draw this showcase session to an end. Thank you all for participating. ESOA and the Global Satellite Coalition will be participating in a few more sessions during this week. I hope everybody will be able to join. Thanks very much.